I always believed betrayal would sound loud. Shouting, screaming, doors slamming. But the night my marriage ended, it was almost peaceful. I remember the streetlights flickering on as I turned into my driveway, and there it was, a black Cadillac parked across my gate. Engine running. Headlights steady, like it had been waiting. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Wrong house. Wrong address. Then I saw her. My wife, sitting in the passenger seat, not crying, not afraid, just calm. And in that stillness, I realized something terrifying. The loudest heartbreak doesn't make a sound. That night, 2 men stepped out of that car, but the real damage had already stepped into my life long before that Cadillac ever blocked my gate. And this is that story. I remember thinking how ordinary the evening felt. The sky was turning that soft shade between gold and gray, the kind that makes everything look quieter than it is. I had driven home the same way I always did, one hand on the steering wheel, the radio murmuring low, my mind somewhere between unfinished work and what I might have for dinner. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No warning, no instinct screaming at me to turn around. And then I saw the Cadillac. It was parked directly in front of my gate. At first, my brain didn't process it as a threat. It registered it as inconvenience. A black Cadillac, polished to a mirror shine, idling where my driveway began. The engine hummed softly, steady and patient. The headlights were on, casting pale beams across the metal of my gate. Not flashing, not aggressive, just there, waiting. I slowed the car without realizing I had taken my foot off the gas. A strange sensation crept into my chest. Not fear, not yet, just a subtle misalignment, like a picture frame hanging slightly crooked on a wall you've stared at for years. Something was off. Maybe it was the way it sat too perfectly centered, not angled like someone who had parked in a rush. Maybe it was the tinted windows, dark enough to swallow any movement inside. Or maybe it was the engine still running, the quiet mechanical breath of something that hadn't arrived by accident. I checked the house number on the mailbox, even though I knew it by heart. Still mine. I looked at the neighboring houses, half expecting to see someone waving apologetically, rushing toward the car with keys in hand. But the street was unusually still. Curtains drawn. Lawns empty. The world had that suspended quality, as if everything around me was holding its breath. I felt it then. Not anger, not panic. Recognition. The kind that starts in the stomach and spreads upward, cold and deliberate. The realization that this wasn't random. The car wasn't lost. It wasn't misplaced. It was positioned. For me, my hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. I became hyper-aware of small details. The ticking sound of my engine cooling, the faint scent of leather from my own car, the distant bark of a dog somewhere down the street. Time didn't stop. It thinned. Each second stretched just enough to make room for doubt. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. A delivery. No logo, a visitor. Then why block the gate? A neighbor's guest? Then why not park in front of their house? My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. Instead, it beat slowly, heavily, as if preparing for impact rather than flight. There's a peculiar stillness that comes before something irreversible happens. Not chaos, but clarity. The air feels heavier. Sounds feel sharper. The Cadillac's engine continued its low hum. Whoever was inside knew I was there. They had to. My headlights were pointed directly at them now, and yet the car didn't move. No attempt to reverse. No signal blinking. No gesture of apology hust patiens. And that patience unsettled me more than confrontation would have. Because waiting implies intention, I thought about honking the horn. I even shifted slightly forward, as if testing whether the car would respond to proximity. It didn't. It remained still, confident in its place, blocking my entrance, denying me access to my own home. That's when the feeling sharpened into something undeniable. This wasn't about parking. This was about positioning, about control. I became aware of how exposed I was sitting there in my car. The driveway that had always felt like refuge suddenly felt like a stage. My house, the place I had paid for, maintained, believed was secure, now partially hidden behind the silhouette of someone else's vehicle. A barrier. And behind that barrier, inside those tinted windows, was something I wasn't prepared to see but somehow already understood. The strangest part was the silence. No music from the Cadillac. No doors opening. No voices. Just the steady, mechanical breathing of the engine and the quiet rhythm of my own thoughts rearranging themselves. I realized, in that suspended moment, that whatever was about to unfold had been set in motion long before I turned onto that street. The car wasn't the beginning. It was the reveal. And as I sat there staring at the reflection of my own headlights in that glossy black paint, I understood that once I stepped out of my vehicle, nothing in my life would return to the shape it had that morning. I didn't step out of my car right away. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the tinted passenger window of the Cadillac, trying to see through it without really wanting to. The headlights from my car reflected faintly against the dark glass, turning it into a mirror. I could see my own face first, pale, confused, older than I remembered. Then, as my eyes adjusted and the interior light shifted slightly, I saw movement inside. A silhouette, and then my wife. She was sitting in the passenger seat. The recognition didn't hit me like lightning. It was slower than that. It crept in, detail by detail. The curve of her shoulder, the way her hair fell across the side of her face, the small gold earring she always wore, the one I bought her on our anniversary 3 years ago. I would have known that outline anywhere. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't reaching for the door handle. She wasn't crying. She was sitting still, angled slightly toward the driver's side, as if she had been in the middle of a conversation. Her posture was relaxed. Too relaxed. One hand rested calmly in her lap. The other seemed to be resting on the center console. That was the first crack. If this had been something forced, something chaotic, there would have been movement, tension, fear. But there was none of that. There was only stillness. Then she looked up, not startled, not guilty in the dramatic sense. Just a whir. Her eyes met mine through the windshield and the glass between us. And in that brief alignment, I felt something inside me collapse with terrifying quiet. Eye contact can be louder than words. In that single glance, there was no denial, no confusion, no attempt to look away quickly, as if pretending not to see me. She held my gaze for a moment longer than comfort allows. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't shame. It was acknowledgement. As if she knew this moment would come eventually. As if we had both, in some unspoken way, been walking toward it for months without admitting it. I searched her face for something familiar. The softness she used to have when I came home late from work. The warmth in her eyes when she would greet me at the door. But what I saw instead was calm. Strange, measured calm that hurt more than panic ever could. Her expression didn't say, "Help me." It didn't say, "This isn't what it looks like." It said something much quieter. "You already know." The realization didn't explode inside me. It settled. Heavy. Final. I became aware of the driver then, a man sitting beside her, one hand casually resting on the steering wheel. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't seem rushed or threatened by my presence. That told me more than any dramatic confrontation could have. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't sudden. This was arranged, but it was her face that held me still. She blinked once, slowly, as if absorbing the weight of being seen. There was no dramatic shift in her posture, no scrambling to explain herself, no frantic movement toward the door. Instead, she straightened slightly, a subtle movement, almost dignified. That small adjustment broke something in me, because dignity means choice, and choice means intention. The silence between us felt immense, even though we were only separated by 2 windshields and a few feet of asphalt. I imagined the thousands of conversations we had shared over the years. Laughter at the dinner table, whispered plans in bed, arguments about nothing that seemed important at the time. All of it reduced now to this single exchange of eyes. I wondered how long it had been going on, I wondered how many times she had sat across from me at breakfast, holding secrets behind that same steady gaze. But strangely, anger didn't arrive first. What came instead was clarity, the kind that strips away illusion without ceremony. In that moment, I understood that betrayal isn't always wild or chaotic. Sometimes it is composed, thought out, carefully stepped into. She didn't mouth an apology. She didn't shake her head. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, but the windows remained closed. The distance remained intact. Whatever words she had, they stayed inside the car. And maybe that was fitting, because there are moments when explanations are unnecessary, when the truth is already complete without being spoken. The headlights reflected in her eyes for a brief second, and I realized I was no longer looking at the woman I thought I knew. I was looking at someone who had already crossed a line long before this night. The only thing left was for me to catch up to the reality she had quietly stepped into. The driver's door of the Cadillac opened, but not in a rush. It moved with a slow, deliberate swing, like an actor hitting a cue they'd practiced 100 times. He stepped out onto the pavement, tall, controlled, and dressed way too sharply for this to be a coincidence. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. And his shoes, they didn't just touch the ground, they claimed it. He adjusted his jacket, a small, confident gesture. The kind of move someone makes when they walk into a room they already own. He didn't slam the door. He didn't charge at me. He just stood there for a moment, his gaze locked on mine. His expression wasn't angry or defensive. It was something else. It was territorial. The low, steady hum of the Cadillac's engine filled the quiet street, a constant reminder of his presence. The streetlights cast this soft, almost cinematic glow over the entire scene, making it feel surreal, like I'd stumbled onto a movie set. Then, the rear doors opened. One on each side, 2 more men stepped out. These guys weren't dressed like him. They weren't about elegance. They were about mass. Broad shoulders, heavy boots, and faces that looked like they were carved from granite. They weren't here to talk things out. They were here to enforce answers. Their eyes found me instantly, not with rage, not with excitement, but with a cold, professional assessment. It hit me right then this wasn't some messy, emotional love triangle drama. This was planned. It was staging a carefully orchestrated display of power. The driver took a few steps forward, closing the distance just enough to make his presence felt without being overtly aggressive. He stopped near the hood of his car, leaning back against it casually, as if he had every right to be there, as if the gate to my own home, right behind him, was his 2-block. The 2 other men fanned out, not like bodyguards getting into formation, but like pieces being moved on a chessboard. One stood near the back of the car. The other drifted to the side, cutting off any clear path around the vehicle. They didn't say a word. Their silence was louder than any threat could ever be. I finally got out of my own car, trying to mirror his calm. I closed my door, and the click of the lock echoed in the stillness, sounding unnaturally loud. Every little noise felt amplified, like the world was holding its breath. The driver watched me walk toward him, and for a split second, his expression looked almost sympathetic. Almost. He tilted his head, studying me, not measuring my strength or my anger, but my reaction. He was watching how I would play my part in his little production, and that's when the true nature of this moment crashed down on me. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about humiliation, and it was meticulously constructed. Parking his car in front of my gate wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a symbol. It meant I couldn't enter my own sanctuary without acknowledging his dominance. It forced me to stand here, on the outside, exposed, while he and his men were positioned, prepared, and in complete control. He finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, almost casual. Evening. Just that one word. No introduction, no explanation, no apology. The casual tone was like a twist of the knife. It reduced this life-shattering moment to a simple transaction, like we were discussing a minor parking dispute instead of the complete implosion of my marriage. My eyes flickered past him, to the passenger seat of the Cadillac. She was still in there. My wife, just watching. She hadn't gotten out to stand with him. She hadn't run to me. She just sat there, framed by the expensive leather and the dim interior lights, like a spectator at a play where she already knew the ending because she helped write the script. The driver noticed my glance. A faint, knowing smile touched the corner of his mouth. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't triumphant. It was just confirmation. He didn't need to say she's with me now. His presence, his car, his men, the way she stayed put it, all screamed it for him. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just incredibly well. One of his men shifted his weight, and the sound of his boots scraping on the pavement was a subtle, yet effective, reminder of their purpose. A reminder that this was not a negotiation. I understood then that this wasn't supposed to end in a fight. If they wanted violence, it would have been quick and brutal. No, this was about something quieter, something more profound. This was about ownership. Not of a house or a car. It was about ownership of the narrative. They had picked the location. They had picked the time. And they had picked the audience, just me. He folded his arms loosely across his chest. "You're not surprised," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a fact. And he was right. The initial shock had already faded, replaced by something colder, heavier, a deep, chilling realization. And I knew, in that moment, that the worst part wasn't seeing him standing there. The worst part was understanding that she had allowed this. She had let him block my gate. She had let him bring these silent, imposing figures to our street. She had allowed my humiliation to be staged under the glow of the streetlights, a performance for an audience of one. My mind raced back, trying to pinpoint the moment it all went wrong. Was it that business trip she took last month? The late nights at the office that became more and more frequent? The way she started guarding her phone like it held state secrets? The signs were all there, weren't they? Little red flags I chose to ignore, or maybe I explained them away because facing the truth was too painful. I had built a narrative in my head where we were just going through a rough patch, where the distance between us was temporary. But this scene, right here, tore that narrative to shreds. This wasn't a rough patch. This was a demolition. The two men were statute, their purpose fulfilled just by existing. They were the physical manifestation of the new power dynamic. The driver pushed himself off the hood of the Cadillac and took one more step toward me. He wasn't invading my personal space, just testing the boundary. He glanced past me for a second, his eyes landing on the house behind the gate. My house. Our house. "Nice place," he said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. Those two simple words carried the weight of a sledgehammer. He wasn't admiring the architecture. He wasn't complimenting my taste in real estate. He was acknowledging it, and in that acknowledgement was a quiet, chilling claim, not in the house itself, but on the moment on-air choice, and on the undeniable fact that I was now standing on the outside of my own life, looking in, while he and his entourage occupied the very center of it. He had not just taken my wife. He had taken my story and was rewriting the ending. And the worst part, she was in the car, watching him do it. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more content. We'll see you in the next one. For a moment, no one moved. The engine continued its steady hum. The two men lingered where they stood. The driver watched me with quiet patience, and she remained inside the car. Then, finally, the passenger door opened. She stepped out carefully, smoothing her dress as her heels touched the pavement. The movement was unhurried, almost practiced. Not dramatic, not frantic. Who's composed? I had imagined this kind of moment before, in those abstract fears that visit you at 3 in the morning and disappear by daylight. In those imagined versions, there were tears, apologies, maybe even anger. But there were none of those things. She closed the car door gently behind her. The sound was soft. Final. She didn't walk to me immediately. She stood beside the Cadillac for a second, aligning herself with the driver rather than apart from him. Not leaning into him, not touching him, but close enough that the space between them felt intentional. The two men glanced at her briefly, ten back at me, as if confirming that this part of the scene was proceeding as expected. When she finally began to walk forward, her steps were measured, each one deliberate. I noticed absurd details, the familiar rhythm of her stride, The way she used to walk across our living room barefoot, the slight tilt of her chin when she was preparing to say something difficult. She stopped a few feet away from me, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough that I could feel the distance. For a second, we just looked at each other. No one interrupted. Even the driver remained silent, allowing this exchange to unfold. Her eyes weren't wild with guilt. They weren't hardened either. They were steady. That steadiness hurt more than chaos would have. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said quietly. The words were simple, controlled, almost gentle. I'm sorry. It's not what you think. Let me explain. Just a statement about timing. As if the issue wasn't what had happened, but how it had been revealed. I felt something shift inside me, then not breaking, not exploding, just settling into place. A realization that this conversation had likely been rehearsed in her mind long before tonight, that she had already weighed outcomes, already considered consequences. There was no trembling in her voice, no reaching for my hand, no tears threatening to spill. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for permission. She was acknowledging a fact. Behind her, the driver shifted slightly, but did not interfere. He trusted the space. Trusted her. That trust told me everything. "How long?" I asked, surprised at how even my own voice sounded. She hesitated, not out of panic, but calculation, as if choosing the version of the truth that would cause the least immediate damage. "It's been some time," she replied. Some time. 2 words that erased months of shared dinners, routine conversations, casual affection. 2 words that suggested this wasn't a mistake born of impulse, but a decision nurtured quietly. The street felt smaller somehow. I searched her face for the woman I had married, for some crack in her composure, some sign that this was tearing her apart too. But what I saw instead was resolve. Not cruelty, not indifference. Resolve. "I was going to tell you," she added, her tone still calm. "I just didn't know how." That might have been the closest thing to vulnerability she allowed herself, but even that felt measured, controlled. She wasn't collapsing under guilt. She was managing a transition. The 2 men remained still, silent pillars framing the moment. The driver watched her with a quiet attentiveness that made it clear this wasn't spontaneous. He wasn't worried she would change her mind. He wasn't worried she would run back to me, because she had already chosen. And the most devastating part wasn't that she stood near him. It was that she didn't look torn. There was no visible battle inside her, no backward glance at the house behind the gate, no lingering attachment to the space we had built together. The absence of hesitation felt heavier than betrayal itself. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said finally. A familiar phrase, one people use when the hurting is unavoidable, but the responsibility feels negotiable. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her, because the truth was becoming clear in a way that didn't require shouting. She hadn't screamed for help when I arrived. She hadn't distanced herself from him. She hadn't asked the men to step away. She stood exactly where she wanted to stand, and in that stillness, in that composed delivery of carefully chosen sentences, I understood that whatever love we once had already been dismantled quietly, piece by piece, long before tonight. This moment wasn't the destruction. It was the confirmation. Navigating heartache is never easy. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please know that help is available. You can find resources in the description below. Thank you for listening. Take care. That night, the moon was dim, casting long, faint shadows that made the familiar world feel strange. I stood by the window, a silent observer in my own life, and watched a black Cadillac pull up quietly to my gate. It was just after midnight. The air still and heavy. The car's engine was a low hum, a discreet announcement of an arrival I knew was coming, yet still dreaded. 2 men I'd never seen before stepped out. They were dressed in sharp, dark suits, their movements economical and precise, like characters from a movie I didn't want to be in. They didn't look at the house. Their focus was solely on the gate, waiting. A moment later, she came down the stairs. The sound of her footsteps on the old wooden steps was a soft, rhythmic countdown to the end. She was carrying a single, small suitcase. the one we had bought together for a trip we never took. She walked past me without a glance, her face set like stone. There were no tears, no last words, just a chilling silence that filled the space between us. I followed her out, my own footsteps echoing hers. When we reached the gate, we stopped. The two men stood impassively, a human barrier between our past and our future. For a long moment, we just stood there, caught in a silent standoff under the indifferent moonlight. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of shared history now condensing into this single, painful moment. I could have shouted. I could have demanded an explanation. I could have fought. A part of me, a primal, wounded part, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. I wanted to ask her if the years we shared meant nothing. If I meant nothing. But looking at her face, so close, yet so distant, I saw the answer. Her decision was made, etched into the resolve in her eyes. There was no room for debate, no space for my pain to register. To create a scene, to beg or to accuse, would have been a performance for an audience that had already left the theater. It would have been a desperate, undignified plea in the face of an immovable reality. My pride, perhaps the last thing I had left, refused to let me break. So, I did the only thing I could. I took a step back, a small, almost imperceptible retreat. It was a concession, an acknowledgement that this battle was already lost. With a quiet sigh that felt like it carried the weight of my entire marriage, I reached out and opened the gate for her. The old iron hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to vocalize the agony I was holding inside. She walked through without a word of thanks, without a backward glance. One of the men took a suitcase, and the other held the car door open for her. She slipped inside, a ghost disappearing into the night. The door closed with a solid, final thud. The car pulled away from the curb, its red taillights shrinking in the distance until they were just two small dots, and then nothing. I stood there for a long time, the empty street stretching out before me. The silence she left behind was louder than any argument we ever had. Eventually, the cold night air seeped into my bones, and I turned back towards the house. The home that was once ours now felt like a hollow shell. Walking back inside, every object seemed to mock me with memories. The photos on the wall, the books on the shelf, the half-empty cup of tea on the table, they were all artifacts of a life that no longer existed. The space she had occupied was now a palpable void, a cold spot in the heart of our home. I sat down on the sofa, the same spot where we had sat together countless times, and the sheer weight of the emptiness pressed down on me. In that profound silence, I understood that the deepest heartbreaks are not the loud, dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones that happen in the dead of night with no witnesses. They are the endings that arrive without a fight, not because of weakness, but because the fight is already over. There was no victory in letting her go, not in the traditional sense. The only victory was in preserving my own dignity. By stepping back, by opening the gate, I had chosen not to be a victim in her story. I had refused to let my final memory of us be one of desperation and humiliation in the quiet wreckage of my marriage. Holding on to my self-respect was the only thing I could control, the only battle I could win, and in the silent, empty house, that small, somber victory was all I had left.